Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Gameweek 20 cheat sheet. We're currently looking at an extremely short turnaround from Gameweek 19, and I am recording this video, unfortunately, before 4 significant Premier League games played, right? So we still need information on certain players, subject the actual playing of matches, but we have some information pre-deadline, and Happy New Year, everyone, as well. For anyone who's just watching the videos fresh, the cheat sheet series is effectively a tier list of FPL assets in all positions, just depending on the price point that the player is at, what kind of function that they feature within your team. And then on top of that, it's kind of just an assessment of the fixture run ahead, my estimation of their minutes on certain players going forwards, and any kind of tactical changes which makes players better or worse, or even injuries, and so on and so forth. So this week, as I said, it's an extremely short turnaround. Unfortunately, we won't have the information of Crystal Palace, Fulham, Liverpool, Leeds, Sunderland, City, and Brentford, Tottenham. What I can say, I think, information-wise, is I think in terms of like big picture players, Chris Richards seemingly might not be fit for the Newcastle game, so that's 2 games. We still have uncertainty over, for example, some injuries within the preceding matches. So Michael Keane, we don't know exactly what's going on with him, but we do have information on, let's say, the Arsenal defenders, and then Rice and Calafiori still doubts. As far as Liverpool, nothing major. We had Gakpo come back, so I think that's huge. Leeds are and Sunderland, I guess, are still missing key players in Rodon and Ballard. Although Ballard seems like he's pretty close to coming back post the Man City game. For Brentford, we have the kind of issue with Igor Thiago and his knock. I do think that this is probably going to be a long-standing issue. I don't think that this is sort of a new issue that Keith Andrews really was talking about. He has already suggested, I think Igor Thiago has been playing on this knock for quite some time now. And I think we've been aware of this because he's been managed heavily within cup games and then, played full matches of Premier League football subsequent to them. So I don't think that really moves the needle too much. I would expect that there's not going to be too many massive kind of new issues unless there's injuries that happen with the actual football being played, which apologies in advance, if this is not captured. But the short turnaround, including the new year, which, as I said, Happy New Year, means that we can't really get a video out in time, but hopefully we've been able to take it into account, of course, all the information up until this point. So to prevent further waffling, let's just jump into the midfielders cheat sheet. As ever, a lot of the stats here in this video will all come from the OptaStats tool, and that's a fantastic tool which you can use in the link in description below to actually get access to the underlying stats for players from previous seasons as well as this season specifically, and even, for example, DEFCON career data on top of current season DEFCON data. Let's just jump into the midfield. Lefay for me gets a drop. That's only because I do think that with the amount of missing players, even let's say Ballard at the back, Sunderland do look a touch worse. I'm not super high on, let's say, Lefay's chances of like the probability of a penalty. Let's just put it like that. But it is plausible, and I think the kind of weird thing with Lefay is I think you can probably make the argument that if he plays in a more advanced position, he's going to get more chances of getting attacking returns, which makes him better. Or if he plays a little bit in a deeper position or maybe a more wide position, that he can actually get more DEFCON in those positions. So I think he's multi-pronged in that sense, but I do think it's not like he gets the benefits of having everything all in one. And then I suppose there's the team strength aspect of things where, of course, if you have doubts, let's say, on Sunderland's attack, and I think a lot of people do, that still is a problem compared to, let's say, someone like Anton Stack, who plays for a Leeds offense who have pretty much, risen like a missile in the last few weeks. And he's benefited as the main set piece taker of the team, not only in being able to score direct free kick goals, which I think he scored 2 this season, but also just more the case in terms of the volume, right? So if you look at the Sunderland game versus the Leeds game, I think that was kind of indicative that Leeds actually have so much control within certain matches at certain points in time, and I think they took over 12 corners, so that's only a boost towards someone like Anton Stack. So to me, he's kind of like the cream of the crop in the midfield. I regret going Lefay over Stack, and that's life for me. In the future, though, I think Garner also deserves a rise. I mean, he's just had a massive return. And I will say that, okay, there's all these players in this list here I think are very prone or capable to having the roots to getting a 1-goal, 1-assist type game. We've seen Dewsbury Hall do it, and they're not players who, as you can see with the underlying stats, have absolutely incredible numbers. Like I think Garner, for example, is very similar in a sense to Miley or Lefay in terms of the numbers, but then actually the set piece aspect of things is a little bit underrated within underlying stats, because you don't really capture just I think the volume that you're putting onto the pitch and the bonus potential as well. If let's say you actually do get that assist within a match, so that kind of creativity is underrated. And that's why we have a lot of players within this list who do well. Elliot Anderson is, I think, losing some set piece share, but the pro that he still has over most of the midfielders here is the DEFCON piece, which hasn't changed too much. So his floor is seemingly a lot higher than most players, but then I think his ceiling is also a little bit lower compared to the rest here, and that's probably the only problem with him. Ultimately, these are players who are probably your eighth attacker, so I don't really see them as massive problems. I think Stack is on the verge of arguably being a perma play player because I think Leeds are very, very impressive to me as a team, and their baselines look good enough for him to be justified as such a player. But they also have some really tough games coming up, and I think you can't sort of dismiss that, which is kind of why we went for, Lefay within my own FPL team, but now have some regrets. As far as, let's say, the next tier of players and the 5.Xs, we did mention that Wilson and Pino were about to head into some tougher fixture periods, and we saw, a slight reduction in Pino minutes in the previous match. I don't think that really changes too much now. It seems like Crystal Palace will be in the market for Brennan Johnson, so if that deal gets done, I think that's Jeremy Pino dropping as well. Once considering that, Sarr is going to come back into the game. Now, Nketiah also being injured, I think is a bit of a pro across the board for all the Crystal Palace attackers because they just simply have to play more players for more minutes. But yeah, that's sort of my take on that. Paqueta has actually been added to the cheat sheet. I kind of struggle with him because I think he might have a back injury, first of all, which I'm not sure we've had updated reporting on, right? So he might not even be available, but that's why we have the asterisks on him. However, he just has all the classic routes towards getting an FPL haul, but I think I can only really keep him as a yellow pick. And I think that's sort of on the basis of we've seen enough from West Ham as of late to kind of say they've actually looked like a pretty solid team. I know that they haven't really been able to make too much of a move in terms of the league table, unfortunately, but the actual results from an underlying perspective, I think for West Ham are getting more impressive. And I think the baselines are moving in a positive enough direction where you're saying, okay, if there's a premium for, let's say, the price to pay for Paqueta, it might be worth it still because of the mixture of the set pieces and the penalties that he gets. So that's going to be Paqueta back on the cheat sheet, but of course, conditional on the injury. Tavernier in a few weeks' time could be interesting. Jorginho just got benched, and that's why I actually didn't want to move Jorginho any higher in the cheat sheet last week because I was actually thinking that a lot of his minutes were conditional on other players being injured, other players being out of form, other players being out of favor. It's not really a case of Jorginho has been any good whatsoever. As you can see, the kind of underlying stats that he's had for this season, for the positions that he sort of plays for this Brighton team, just aren't really good enough. And no real updates and thoughts on him. However, taking a switch back into Tavernier, I mean, he's actually going to be a fantastic pick. And I think Kluivert, who is not on the cheat sheet right now, will also be on the cheat sheet soon. It's just that Tavernier, I think, is a lot more easy to stomach as a pick because of the price point you're paying for. And considering the volume of his returns, considering that he's on a multitude of set pieces, that's a lot more stomachable than, let's say, Kluivert at the price point that he's at, considering he's not, for example, the sort of attacking quality of a player like a Semenyo is. In the next tier, I think we start to have really good value. So I do think right now there's a bit of a chasm between, let's say, the basically midfielders who cost around 4.9 to 5.2 million, and then players who are in that 6 million tier. The one player I haven't really touched on was actually Reinders. I think the reason why I'm struggling to actually give Reinders a rise is there's so much influx of players for City. Not only sort of players coming back from injury like Doku, but then also the impending Semenyo transfer. I just think that means that Turkey probably has to share some of his minutes, maybe like in let's say, moving inside a little bit. So let's say the player who's going to lose his spot most likely is not Foden and not Cherki to me, but Reinders. So that's why I don't think Reinders makes any sense. But yeah, going back to that 6 million tier, after that a bit of a riff on Reinders and his sort of future expectation of minutes, Kudus to me actually does deserve a rise. I think he's not had a great season so far, but this is a player who potentially could be on penalties. I think most people actually see that Simmons or Simons is probably going to be the penalty taker of this team, just given that he actually has an extensive penalty record. When we saw the Champions League game where Kudus took a penalty, I think there were some arguments that could have been made that, let's say, because that was him in search of his first home goal, that he took the first penalty over Xavi. But I think it's very likely that he could still be the penalty taker because he's almost, I would think, a more important player for the team. Maybe Thomas Frank is able to sort of effectuate decision-making on that level to allow Kudus to stay on penalties. He does have set pieces as well, and I think he obviously is a player where you're kind of looking at him and thinking, what are these open play numbers like? Because they're not very, very good. And I would probably be inclined to agree with you. The tough thing with Tottenham, I suppose, is we have sort of pictured them as a team that has not been good at all this season, particularly from the attacking phase of things. And Kudus has not really benefited from that. However, I think if you probably think that there's a change in direction in the team that's plausible, and if other players are moving out of the team like Brennan Johnson, his minutes are kind of secure. The fixture run's actually really good for Tottenham, and he kind of has those intangibles from an FPL sense where I think it does make sense to give him a rise towards this category. Is he as good as a Turkey? No, I don't think so. I think Turkey is by far and away the best player in this tier. And I think Turkey's a tricky pick because I think for the people who have already moved into Turkey, you are almost holding a luxury prime asset and you're just saying, I'm just going to enjoy life with this player. Whereas I think other people who are sort of, on the outside looking in will probably be asking themselves the question of, do I go for someone like Ryan Cherky? Because the tricky thing is with the influx of players, does that just mean that his minutes will be reduced in the future? And I think my answer would be yes, but I think he's also of such a high quality that he is still someone who actually determines whether he stays on the pitch, in the sense that if he's having a good game, I really do struggle to believe that City would take him off. Like if City were in a position where they were sort of struggling as a team and he was generally, playing okay-ish, I think he tends to stay on because that's the quality that City need to win football games. And I can't really say that for some of the other players. But with players like Semenyo coming in, like you could see, for example, I guess the priority of certain players changing too. And I think Turkey could get hurt by that. But until that point comes and we see that physically happen, I wouldn't be worried. Sobo is sort of just a player who you almost are banking on with the good fixtures left. I would say, yes, of course, Arsenal away is in the distance in Game Week 21, but it's probably a case of if you are owning Sobo now, you're buying for, let's say, Game Week 22, and he's a player who at least you can hold for the next few weeks and then just say, I'll reconsider after Burnley at home. That's almost, I think, the short-term position that I would take with most of the Liverpool picks within, our teams and how we sort of plan FPL. With Minte, unfortunately, with the injury, he gets a drop. I think, as I kind of predicted last week, the really good cameo performance with Arsenal just meant that he was going to start and he was probably going to play even more minutes. He was very good within the match, obviously earned a penalty, which Welbeck did convert and, converted and did not convert the second one. But what I would say about Minte is I was pretty confident he was going to do well. There was some sort of reporting around Fabian, I guess, being unhappy with Minte. I felt that was a little bit overblown. At the end of the day, as a manager, I think if you kind of have a bit of a tenuous relationship with a player, but he's a key significant player, you're not going to spend a lot of time in the media sort of gassing up the player. And there is an opportunity to, I guess, humble the player too, while still actually taking the most out of his services and actually playing him. So I wouldn't be too worried about Minte and actually his minutes when he comes back from injury, but we'll see what happens because it does seem like he might be involved in some transfer rumors. And on the Brighton front, it seems like Pascal Gross is joining Brighton. So is that going to have a huge impact in FPL? No, because I don't think he's a really good def conner either. But it's positive potentially for like the overall almost view of Brighton as a team, right? Because I think he is the type of profile that Brighton haven't really enjoyed, at least in the last year or so. He's a bit more of a controller type. I guess you can compare Ayari to this, but I think he is a very versatile piece there that can sort of improve the level of Brighton as a team and therefore some of the picks that we're going to go for in the future. For that next tier with Rice, I've just given an asterisk towards him. I find it very tricky to, make thoughts on my cheat sheet that are, I think this person's going to get a massive drop because you don't really get information around Arsenal. It seems like the reporting that we can get is that, it was a touch and go decision with him for the Bournemouth match, or sorry, not the Bournemouth match, but the Aston Villa game, and that he might actually be fit for the Bournemouth game. But we don't really know exactly what the case is going to be because it also comes down to the swelling that Arteta talked about with Rice, and I have no idea what's going to happen in a few days' time. What I will say, though, is I think the long-term value of Rice as an asset is still there. So when you're kind of looking at this fixture run, I think the question for most managers is if you own Rice right now, is it a case of can you bench him for one more week or even have, let's say, someone auto-sub? Because otherwise he's a very easy and comfortable hold, I would say. With Sade, he gets a drop because I think that's fixture run related. I think Brentford's fixture run is starting to get a bit worse now. I felt quite happy when Sade got a hat-trick last week because he was always on the cheat sheet despite doing nothing, technically. And that's kind of what we're in the business of in FPL, right? You're trying to kind of guide people towards decisions where you're thinking, okay, this player or that player is going to get better expectations going forwards because of fixtures, and he might make sense as a pick. It's not really what have they done lately, but what I think they can actually do in the future. But similarly, I think in this vein, with the worsening fixtures, I'm giving Sade a drop. Bruno G, I have to give him a rise. I do think probably a bit harsh for me to maybe make him an orange in anticipation for a great fixture run. I don't think he's like an elite pick, because I did sort of mention the reservations I have around sort of his ability to get points. The thing in FPL that I struggle with this season is there's so many midfielders who've all gotten these crazy hauls and returns, and you can't really say, like, I mean, how reproducible that is for most players when some of the hauls and some of the returns actually just come from these one sort of unique circumstances of, I don't know, playing Burnley one match, or having a successive run of games where I guess, you're overperforming a lot. So for example, that, like, even if I think back about Dewsbury Hall and when he had a bit of a crazy run of 4 to 5 fixtures where he did extremely well, I mean, that comes from still returns like that, I think, weak foot finish versus United at Old Trafford. And that kind of illuminates the picture of that, okay, there's so many good value midfielders, but I think when you kind of look at the baselines in terms of underlying stats and other things like that, it's very hard to sort of call that everyone is good. I would still almost go back to what are the potentials for these players to get points in different avenues, and then actually sort of judge from there. So I think with Bruno G, fair enough with the underlying stats, with the really good NPXG, and he did score a goal and have really good XG within that game. So yeah, probably underrated that a little bit, but it is also Burnley tax. So yeah, I think he deserves a rise, but that's about it. I've given Gordon a drop. I just think one of my concerns with Gordon still is that he doesn't actually seem like that threatening of an attacker. If you look at his baselines this season, I think the cheat sheet is helpful in the sense that you're looking at the non-penalty numbers. So this season, he's actually had pretty decent non-penalty numbers in terms of NPXG, but it's not something that's like absolutely far of left field, considering that this is a player who ultimately doesn't play 90 minutes. So I think it's nice that he's gotten some 90 minutes and 80 minutes recently, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the minutes going forwards, because we know that he's always been dealing with a recurring hip injury, and I think some of the injuries at present for Newcastle do allow for Gordon to play extra minutes. So I think when Burnley comes off the table, I'd probably say I wouldn't love him that much as a pick. With Rodgers, I think he also gets a rise. This is pretty obvious. Still, you've got Crystal Palace away and Newcastle away in the distance, and I think that's not great. So when we look at the Rodgers fixtures, yes, it's much better because he no longer plays versus Chelsea and Arsenal, which for both games I think he scored 1 point in, just because tough game. I mean, I wouldn't say the yellow card was expected per se, but it's just you don't expect crazy attacking returns like he's been able to get this season, especially with the context that he's already had crazy attacking returns without much baselines so far. So is the finishing real with Morgan Rodgers? I absolutely can accept that argument. But I think the thing is the fixtures are still not that great. However, you do have 2 home games in the distance, and I think he deserves a rise as a result of this. Semenyo gets the drop for me because I think there's uncertainty around, whether he even makes the Arsenal game, which Iraola kind of dismissed. His response in the post-match not press conference, but interview, was that he's going to expect to see Semenyo to play versus Arsenal. I personally think that him joining City is going to kind of ruin him as a pick. I mean, it's interesting that when I was watching him, I mean, like, you see the long throw assist versus Chelsea too. Like, I don't know how much of that, value we're going to see. Like, he's not going to have penalty share. Don't see him getting free kick share. Don't see him getting the minutes in City as well. So to me, this is a player who, unfortunately, we might be saying bye to anyways in FPL. But what a pick he has been. As far as Cunha, I think he gets a soft drop. I just think my concern with United was always going to be around Mount, because I think, when you're without Bruno, I think that this team could function on paper with a Mainu or a Mount at least within the team. But a pivot of Ugarte and Casemiro is not exactly something that I think is conducive to a functioning attacking team, which is kind of why I actually swerved from the Cunha captaincy within my own team selection, because it didn't seem like Mount was actually close towards the Wolves game. And I think that was sort of the right call. They were pretty shocking in the sense that if you're expecting for United to take advantage of one of the best fixtures in the league by far, you'd expect a lot more from that game. And I don't think we saw absolutely enough to say that maybe even for the short term that Cunha is going to be that electrifying as a pick. But it's also plausible that some players come back, right? Mainu and Mount possibly could be back for the next 2 games, and maybe I'm underrating Cunha from that perspective. I just think end of the day, I'm not that much of a fan of United without the key players missing. Saka and Palmer, no real changes there. The concern with Palmer is just minutes, right? You just kind of see, okay, yes, of course, he can take a penalty versus Bournemouth, but playing 17 minutes, that also just means you're taking so much whole potential off of the table. And that effectuates bonus, that effectuates, whether he's going to get another return within a game, because 95-minute players will do that very, very often. And that is kind of pretty much it for the midfield position. The one player I might have actually missed out on in terms of the midfield was actually Trossard, or is actually Trossard. He's actually at an interesting price point where I find it a little bit hard to judge Trossard, because to me, he's always going to be Arteta's starting left winger just based on the form that he's in this season. But it's kind of hard to judge whether like players like Eze and Martinelli can kind of be brought back into the squad, because I feel like this recent period has been marked by Arteta going back to the players that he trusts. So, we have not seen Eze almost at all recently. We have not seen much of Martinelli, who clearly has not been the best like just over the last 2-3 years. We have not seen much from Miles Lewis-Skelly, for example, this season. And so that's the kind of context for why I struggle to put Trossard in here, because I do think this is a very deep Arsenal team. They still have multiple competitions to play in, and is it the case that Trossard just plays, 80 minutes a match within Premier League? It's very plausibly the case that he can do that. So that's kind of a personal call that I think a lot of managers have to make. And to be honest, managers do have the room to do this, because, someone like Trossard, for example, has played exceptionally well this season, and I think you kind of just play the fixtures as it is. Like, these Arsenal games are not the best, but they're such a strong squad that you probably still think, okay, with games like Bournemouth away, Liverpool at home, that maybe you still hold a lot of value towards owning Arsenal players and attackers in this sense. So that's pretty much it with Trossard. And yeah, he's an interesting pick for me. I have a love-hate relationship with Trossard. And I think right now, he's in a really good period in terms of minutes as well. So I think that's kind of the basis for him being on the cheat sheet. But how long will these good minutes last? Because only a few weeks ago, if you go back to, let's say, that period of when he was injured and stuff, we weren't seeing great minutes from him. And that's always the tricky piece. So let's just see how that goes. But if we head on towards the forwards, the only change here is almost bolstering some of the budget picks and then nerfing some of the top picks, which I'm frustrated with, because I think with João Pedro and Walter, I was sort of expecting for their minutes to be poor. And then Delap obviously had an injury, which meant that João Pedro played a lot more minutes than I expected. But then he also came back to very, very soon, and you still see João Pedro, sent back into the bench, that sort of thing, despite Delap not really being, I think, a key player for this team yet. With Waltermod, you see the same thing with Wisa, where I think that's kind of him firmly off the table now as a serious pick in FPL, because with Wisa also having a relatively good performance, and obviously that being a good game to sort of table Wisa on, because it's Burnley. That to me just suggests that you're still going to see these early subs going forwards, and it's just a problem. With Barry, I think it's a bit of a pro that he's doing well, at least compared to Beto. And at that sort of price point for an Everton forward, I think he's still really good value. So to me, he gets a rise as well. But that's kind of it for the forward position. To me, the best picks are still Calvert-Lewin, Bowen, Thiago, Ekitike, Haaland. These are players who play effectively at least 85 minutes a game for Calvert-Lewin. Everyone else here, and Ekitike as well, Thiago, Bowen, Haaland are all 90-minute players, although Thiago's subject to sort of his own injury situation. But the positive, I think, for most of these players is that ultimately minutes will get you returns. I don't think there's a single player here who plays really poor minutes that we can say gets, disproportionate returns, which makes us think we have to keep them. The forward position is almost a lot of players who have done well, I think, when they've had the right minutes. And that's kind of, I think, representative even of someone like Mateta. With the Welbeck and Raul, I think with Welbeck coming back into fitness, that's going to be a rise for him, just because his baselines are really, really strong. They don't have a lot of depth in the team. They have a lot of injuries that mean that Welbeck should be playing most of the matches when he can. And you're moving back into an area or time, at least in terms of FPL, where I don't think you have that many midweek fixtures in a few weeks' time. So he's going to make sense as a pick, probably. If you think he can start game week 20 versus Burnley, I think that's already the time to jump back onto someone like a Welbeck. But when we get towards game week 22, for example, like I kind of still like Welbeck a lot as a pick, because we're moving into a slightly less busy schedule, at least for teams who are not involved in continental football. As far as Raul, the Muniz timeline actually seems like it's even much more extended. It seems like he's expected back mid-February. So that just means Raul's going to be a lot more value as a pick long term, despite some of the fixtures in the short term being really poor. With the defensive changes, if we just move on to defenders, not too much in terms of the budget defenders. I think this is very much just based on the injuries that we have right now in FPL. Like Rodon's clearly injured. I don't know exactly how long for, but that's why he gets a drop. Goodmunson is really good value in the sense that you actually are owning a Leeds defender for a really decent price point. It is almost a player that you're kind of saying, okay, he's decent NPXGI, and then actually the rest of it's just clean sheet potential. So not much DEFCON potential here, but a classic sort of fullback option who's clearly not as explosive as potentially, let's say, a Dorgu. But then you also see, for example, Dorgu on the weekend, and Amram sets up in a 3. So, I mean, I was on the deadline stream looking at the Man United lineup, and I thought that was set up in a back 3. Some people actually suggested that he was going to play 4-2-3-1. The game started with Dorgu left wing back, and I think that was expected per me just looking at Xerxes starting. And I think it just shows you that, you know, how much the team is sort of impacted by key players like Mount missing, key players like Bruno missing, and the lack of available substitutes when you have, let's say, Manu also injured at the same timeline, which is unfortunate, right, for United. But that's going to effectuate someone like Dorgu, and I don't, you know, I'm not perfectly in love with Dorgu anyways. When you take away Wolves at home from someone's fixture run, they're just going to get worse, which is why he gets a drop. Dallo gets a drop for the same reason. Keane, I've put an asterisk towards him. Same with Richards. These are both players who I think could miss out on fixtures. But I think the whole point of Richards is that this is a player that you kind of set and forget. He should be back for the run where Crystal Palace actually starts to play some really, really easy games, which would be Gameweek 24 onwards. With Keane, I mean, this is a player who actually just has amazing fixtures. So if he's ill, for example, like from Gameweek 19, and that's why he missed out, he's an amazing pick for Gameweek 20 onwards. I don't really know what the timeline is. Potentially, it's not a serious injury, because I feel like maybe if it was very serious, we would not have seen, or we would have probably got a Moyes talking about it. But he also seems to be, not irrationally, but I mean, he seems to be strangely coy about some of these injuries. So hard to say exactly where Keane is at, but I'm hoping he's fine for the weekend. Otherwise, of course, you know he's going to get a drop. Hincapié to me gets a drop because the reporting on Calafiori seems to be the case that he might be, you know, close. Like, for example, some of the recent benching, some of the recent sort of taking players out of the squad for Arsenal is actually just to manage the injury, manage the load, and to not put someone in a position where they're going to get themselves injured. I think the con here is that if Calafiori comes back, I don't really see Hincapié starting games. I think Calafiori will just, you know, slot back into left back. I think Miles Lewis-Skelly has also cameoed decently at left back too, but I think Hincapié is clearly sort of first choice over him. But Gabriel being back also means that I think Hincapié is off the table. Sure, Gabriel can have managed minutes, but I think managed minutes is exactly what we saw within the Aston Villa game. I feel like it's more Gabriel starts games and then he comes off a little bit earlier, and Arsenal tried to sort of manage the game without him. And when they have lots of cup games coming up soon, that's an opportunity to simply just not play Gabriel whatsoever and allow him to sort of build up on his fitness, whilst you still prioritize some really short-term games here for Arsenal. Because the way I see it is, Bournemouth away was, for example, a game where they actually dropped points last season. Arteta's the type of manager, in my mind, who will still try to put his best foot forward as much as possible, and Gabriel's always a player who, even on sort of injury thresholds, or, you know, with knocks and stuff, has tried to play through them. So I do think Gabriel will most likely survive with starts over this period. I could be wrong, but I just think that this is a time to move into Gabriel, regardless of whether the fixtures are not amazing for Arsenal up until, let's say, Game Week 24. Same with Timber, where now that he's back, I think he just goes back to being a green pick in FPL. The other changes, to me, are not too significant. I think across the board, you know, we had some rises for some Newcastle defenders. I still think that they're in the midst of a great run, and that's pretty much it. Hall, I think, is actually showing a lot of DEFCON potential for a fullback. So I'd love to make him a green pick, but I think maybe some of the question marks around whether he might, you know, be suffering from a knock at least, is a bit problematic for me to sort of give him another rise. So I feel like the cheat sheet is going to stay a bit stagnant in terms of defense for this week. In the goalkeeping position, John, to me, actually kind of usurps Dubravka in terms of, if you have a player who actually has this sort of value at 4.0, I mean, he's much better than Dubravka, so that's why Dubravka also gets unseated from that green tier, and John gets added. Petrovic is someone who I think I'm also going to drop, because I think the Bournemouth numbers have only gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. It's not really just the home and away piece now. It's the every game piece. And so that's the only change here for the goalkeeping position. Thank you guys so much for watching the cheat sheet, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.